We should start. Okay, so same deal. There's seats around everywhere now. So now that we don't have crashers that haven't been admitted. So we're going to start with before we do the Fire in Paradise documentary. So this is Thursday. This is our lecture on the documentary. This week it's Fire in Paradise. There have been some questions that have been piling up in the Q&As that I want to get to. So people should be calming down now, relaxing, just breathe. And remember, the Q&A for lecture number 4 is open on Canvas, but there are a number of questions from the last 2 Q&As I just didn't get to because they weren't there when I was checking. So I'm going to do them now because they're important questions. And I really like the idea of this class being motivated by your interests and questions rather than me just doing, program. I'll try to answer these off the cuff as best as I can whenever you have questions. I may get facts wrong or something, but I'll give it a shot. So the first one, and this is actually from last week, someone asked, do you believe that your generation has the potential to get involved in politics soon enough? This person notes by 2030, most of us in the room will only have been able to vote in 2 elections. Will you be able to get involved soon enough to make a significant difference politically before we get too far down the road towards total unmanageable global consequences? And then the person has a great follow-up, important follow-up. Do you think that we have the chance of getting the candidates who will actually stick to promises and make a difference in front of our generation in order to have good options to vote for in time, since it seems so hard to convince the majority that young leaders are necessary? If someone asked that question a few years ago, I would have been kind of pessimistic. I mean, way back, Al Gore has been on the scene since the 1970s in Congress, and he was the vice president for a while, ran for president. But beyond that, there just haven't been. But there have been incredibly viable candidates recently. So in the 2020 election, I may have mentioned, Bernie Sanders ran for the Democratic nomination. He did not win to Joe Biden, but he took a number of important states like California, and he had a real shot at it. Ultimately, Biden had twice as many votes as Sanders, but that's, not that large of a gap if your generation came out and voted. And regarding this about young leaders, I mean, the go-to example now, and this is again new on the scene, would be AOC. AOC was in her 20s. She was the youngest female identified individual ever elected to, I think, Congress, certainly the House of Representatives. And she didn't have a great deal of background. In fact, Donald Trump kept calling her that bartender from Queens because she was in fact working as a bartender at the time. So yeah, there are people. And if you want to know if they have a commitment to it, we're going to read AOC's Green New Deal, which she put forward with some other folks, and she did that as soon as she got into office. That was like a primary thing. It was part of her promise. And if you're interested, like in Bernie Sanders, he has an even more complete Green New Deal plan if you go to his personal website and all. So the answer to that, I absolutely think there are candidates waiting, really want to be there. Maybe some of you will be those candidates, and you can make a difference, but you really need to get out and vote. Someone says, does flying in general use up your carbon budget for the year? No. I mean, if you fly from here, Santa Barbara, up to the Bay Area, it's not going to. It's all a question of miles. I gave the example of flying across the U.S. as being a big problem. But at the end of this course, the last week, we're going to use a carbon calculator so you can actually figure out those things for yourself. For some of you, flying may absolutely be the biggest problem you have. So how will the Willow Project that was approved in Alaska affect U.S. carbon emissions? So Willow Project is under appeal right now. So what it is the North Face of Alaska. For many decades now, politicians and oil companies have been eyeing it up because there's a great deal of oil underneath of that. Some of it was covered with permafrost, but now with the climate change, it's warming, it's accessible. And unfortunately, the Biden administration has approved it, but now it's under appeal. It's probably going to go forth. We don't know yet. but it is going to impact U.S. emissions somewhat. But one of the issues is it's also going to be importing oil to the world. So if you are familiar with like the Keystone Pipeline and all, what that was about is getting oil derived from tar sands from the center part of this continent to the West Coast, where it could be shipped to the rest of the world. So it's going to raise global emissions, absolutely, if it happens. It's something that shouldn't happen right now. Yeah, the next question is a longer one, asking about net zero carbon emissions and talking about the fact that even if somehow the US were not on the scene with our emissions, there's going to be a ton of emerging economies, countries that are now emitting a lot of emissions. This person talks about for example, China and India, and it's true. China is now the largest emitter on the planet. India is growing very quickly. India is sitting on top of, as you may know from before the flood, a huge amount of coal if they decide to burn it and all. So it really comes down to, and this is one of the frustrating things, and if you had English 2, maybe English 22, you might have got an insight into this, is this so-called American way of life, this European way of life that now has sort of been catalyzed as the American way of life, that's now going all over the planet. And before, people didn't have the priorities that we have made priorities. One of the things would be like car ownership. So since like 1989, car ownership in China has gone up 10,000%. You can't blame China for that, because we have more cars in the US than any other country per capita. We have more cars than we have licensed drivers in the United States. We've sold the world on the idea that cars are cool. Why? Because when that industry really picked up during the 50s and 60s, we were producing 70% of all the cars on the planet. So it is an issue. And again, it's not so much the US now, but the US American lifestyle that's a problem. But I would argue, for you folks, I don't think there is an American lifestyle, this sort of American dream thing that's consolidated across the whole country. So in other words, people aren't like, you know, what are people doing in Arkansas or Ohio or South Dakota? I mean, no, slight to any of those places, but mainly people around the world look to California and the West Coast and East Coast, certainly, and influencers are all here. So, I mean, we have an enormous opportunity to influence the world in that sense, but we're not doing it in a good way. I mean, the influencers here are flying in planes, and the whole idea is how much can you consume, how quickly can you consume it, and how good can you make it look online. So, yeah, it's a really good question, though. Yeah, next question. How am I supposed to convince my parents to care about climate change when they can't even understand that it's an anthropogenic, i.e. human-caused problem? So this person adds then, their parents say things like, it's a natural cycle. Wildfires have always happened in California. Pakistan was built on a floodplain. Well, all those things aren't right. And if you look at, say, wildfires, have they always happened in California? Absolutely. But given what we're going to talk about today, pushing back the rain season, they're happening more than they ever have, more severe. And if you just look at the numbers in the last decade, it's phenomenally different. It's natural cycles. You'll hear this argument, well, the climate has always been changing. We had ice ages in the last, 100,000 years, quite a few of them. Maybe this is just a warming cycle and an ice age is going to come. The problem is, if you look at, so we know the impact of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas. We've known that for well over 100 years. And when you do the models, the amount of heating that's happening, whether it's Santa Barbara, Ventura, or anywhere else, is consistent with those models. So it's not like there's some sort of climate change that's doing it. It's just like if you turn the oven on in your house, it's going to warm up because you're putting heat into it. We know exactly how much those changes should be, and they're consistent with the models. And those models, by the way you test them is you build a computer model and you push it back like the last 100 years. Can that model accurately predict what happened in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up to the teens this century? And if it can, it's a pretty good likelihood it's going to predict what's coming next. So, yeah, but good question. Will we discuss water scarcity in this class? Because this person notes it's really not talked about enough. And I agree with that, but we will talk about it, but it's not a primary focus. But it's a great general point because right now the climate crisis is the #1 environmental problem on the planet, full stop, no question. But there are a range of other environmental problems. And in some ways they get overshadowed by the climate crisis. Water scarcity is already an issue across the planet. It's already an issue in California. If you look what's happening to the Colorado River, you can see it. If you look at aquifer levels dropping, it's pretty obvious. There are all sorts of point source pollution problems. What I mean by that is people in factories putting pollutants directly into the ground, the air, or the water, and they have to be addressed too. So, yeah, we won't be talking all about that because the focus really is on the climate crisis. What's my opinion on the use of nuclear power to mitigate the effects of global warming? So I'm not an expert on this, but I do have opinion. And I would also note that this is a controversial issue. So I'd venture to say that overwhelmingly most environmentalists say no to nukes. However, there are some. One is a group called the Eco-Modernists, that they're from the Bay Area. They're high-tech people. They're in favor of that sort of thing. Maybe the most famous is Steven Pinker, and they are very much pro-nukes. And the argument they make is, well, we wouldn't have anywhere near the amount of atmospheric CO2 if we had gone all nuke back in the 1970s or so. And the go-to example, one of them would be something like France. France gets, I think, around 60% or nearly 60% of its electricity from its nuclear power plants. And that's a great success story. The problem is there are stories that aren't nearly as successful. So 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima. And the other issue with that is, and one of the bigger issues is, what do you do with the waste? And right now in the United States, for example, that waste is generally never taken out of power plants. And the reason is no community wants to have a truck going through their community filled with nuclear waste. What if it gets into an accident and spills? So right now there's no central storage facility. It's all in drums on those sites. And if you look at something like Diablo Canyon, if you go down towards San Diego, that's been decommissioned. Sure, it seems like that power plant is done and over, but there's an incredible amount of radioactive waste there that will be there for at least 50,000 years. And if you look at that, it's like Fukushima and many other power plants, they're built on coastal areas because they use the water for cooling. So if you had something, it wouldn't have to be a tsunami like this, what happened with Fukushima. It could just be a tidal surge caused by a cyclonic storm hitting here. It's not good to have it. So that being said, many people would argue, and I probably would accept the argument, that we truly shouldn't decommission the plants that are working, because that 70% of electricity in France, we should probably continue to get it. But the other big issue regarding nukes, and this is kind of the deciding one for everyone, even if you don't care about any of the environmental things, it's just much too expensive now. In the teens of this decade, of this century, the cost of solar went down by a factor of 10. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal drop. And we have principally China to thank for that, because China went into full-scale production and they just, economy of scale, they lowered it dramatically. Wind has almost similar gains. So right now, if you're going to build a new power plant, first off, the traditional ones like coal and gas, methane plants, they are no longer as cheap as solar or wind. And it's incredibly costly to do a nuclear power plant. The final thing I'd say about that is fusion is always something that people talk about. When I was your age, they were talking about it being 30 years away. They're still talking about it 30 years from now. But yeah, that may happen, but I wouldn't count on that. Another one about water scarcity, we kind of talked about that. Next question, is there any federal effort to increase the disaster response forces in preparation for worsening natural disasters? Yeah, so FEMA, which is in the United States, the group that responds to these things, they have been ramping up because of it. This actually sort of taps into a bigger issue that's very worrisome. And that is, and we're going to see it even today. So the fire in Paradise, California, the Camp Fire, as they noted, or I'm going to actually note in some of the slides coming up, that was the most expensive natural disaster on the planet that year. And just dealing with the damages of the climate crisis, like that wildfire, like, flooding and all, that's becoming more and more expensive. And people have worked out the numbers, and the numbers will soon be that's going to cost more than anything else, just dealing with the damages. So we're actually going to have a whole week on something, Project Drawdown, where they make the argument we should spend the money now before we have damages. In other words, we should try to mitigate this. We should put in more wind, more solar, move away from cultural practices like driving and eating beef and all. That is the cheapest thing that we could do now. So you're going to have people tell you, maybe your parents will tell you, it's just too expensive to address all these issues. It's actually dirt cheap. And that's just in dollars, let alone in the cost of lives and all, like we've seen in the documentary. Here's another good question. While the UC may have lowered its emissions overall, when I went to the Arbor not too long ago, I saw that the Mediterranean wrap was manufactured with palm oil. Seems paradoxical the UCSB would pledge to be more environmental friendly while still selling and profiting from items with palm oil. Have there been any attempts to halt the sale on campus? Yeah, so let's be clear about that. In terms of the UC campuses, UCSB has lowered their emissions more than any other. We've reduced it by 2/3. That's remarkable. All that's the good. The flip side is there is so much more to be done. And palm oil, I think, is an important issue, but it's not the biggest in terms of emissions, and it's not even the biggest in the Arbor. So if you know the Arbor, it's that little sort of sandwich shop convenience store over by South Hall and Gravette's. And why is because, there is a Subway in there, Subway sandwich shop. And, a friend of mine, Renan Leroux, you may know, and if you don't, take classes from him. He's in the French department. His vow is to make UCSB an entirely vegan campus, to make us the first entirely vegan campus in the United States. And he's argued, for example, that in terms of water use, there's probably ultimately more water use goes for that Subway than the entire campus. And the reason for that is because of all the beef and animal products that are there. And I could be wrong on this, so correct me if I am. I believe that Subway uses palm oil when you get things made with oil there. Last I heard, they're making an effort, maybe it's greenwashing, maybe it's not, to suggest that the palm oil is sustainably obtained. I'm not quite sure how they figure that out. There is no international standard on what, is sustainable or not in terms of palm oil, but it is a question. But it does. The whole issue is there are tons of things that yet to be done. And if you are concerned about something like this, I would definitely suggest to go to the sustainability website, to go look at one of the organizations there, whether it's something like EAB, the Environmental Affairs Board, CalPIRG, any number of them, and get involved. And if you all decide in those organizations you want to make this an issue, I think you could do something about it, but that's kind of what it takes. Someone calling me on my fax here that I said Manhattan is the most expensive zip code in the US. I think I did. It was kind of a turn of speech. I didn't actually mean that. It's the most expensive city to live in the United States, which I think is right. But anyhow, this person notes then, because it's one of the most densely populated parts of the US, that therefore it makes sense to pursue efforts to protect it because thousands of residents live there. In fact, millions of people, almost pushing 2 million, I think, or 1.5. That's true. And it is the case that we're going to spend a fortune to protect Manhattan, and we'll probably wind up protecting Santa Barbara and Montecito too, because so much wealth is aggregated here, and probably down the coast of California because they're so wealthy. But the sad thing is, if you look at other cities across the planet, they have nowhere near the resources to protect themselves in that way. You look at Mumbai, India, it has literally 10 times the population of Manhattan. It's already having extraordinary impacts on the climate crisis, and whole countries, I mentioned Bangladesh, they just don't have anywhere near the wealth here. So it's a justice issue. Will Manhattan be okay? Yeah, I wouldn't hesitate to buy real estate in Manhattan if you could possibly afford it. But I don't think, is this fair to have done that happened? Yeah. So let's go to this. So what are the, oh, and by the way, let me just check. That was from yesterday and the previous one. Did people give me any new questions as this has been opened? They did. So this is from today. If you have some, put them in there. And but do make sure they're on either the material or delivered or some environmental thing like nuclear power. So what I have noticed in my readings in the documentary so far is the deeply entrenched interest of major corporations through billions of dollars in lobbying to all levels of governments. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on how significant lobbying is rejecting climate change legislation and plans, and what can actually be done about these massive influences, as lobbying has been a major player in politics since the early middle 20th century. Yeah, it's absolutely right. The answer, and this is the suggestion by people like Bernie Sanders, is do not allow lobbyists to lobby politicians. So in other words, politicians can and have, in some cases in Congress, received literally millions of dollars from fossil fuel companies. Just don't allow that to happen. Bernie Sanders, I'll mention him again, give him another plug. I don't think he'll be running again, so it's not like I'm trying to sell you on him. Him on you. He ran his whole campaign just with, crowdsourced with small donations that he got online. But the problem is, it needs to stop. And it's not, so one of the things they do is to go directly to politicians, but they also are interested in changing public opinion. And, because it's a democracy, you could only get so far if you couldn't change public opinion. You might get politicians in office that you like, and it'll do your bidding, but if the public realized that these people weren't acting in their interest, they'd vote them out. So you have to change public opinion. And their groups, one of them would be the Koch family, formerly the Koch brothers. One of them passed away a couple of years ago. And they spend massive amounts of money. So if you actually go online, I think it's still on YouTube even, it's a Netflix series that is, it's not produced anymore, called Patriot Act. And they have a great segment on mass transportation and a city that decided to put extraordinary energy into mass transportation, more mass transit, more bicycle and other infrastructure and all. And the Koch brothers came in and spent millions of dollars convincing the public that they should not vote for this. And the argument is very easy. Almost always the argument here centers on, this is going to cost you money. Do not vote for this. Your taxes will go up. We don't need this. This is a bad idea. And they convince that community not to do it. So enormous efforts go to that too. So it's a real problem. And the irony is those interests have so much money at stake that they can spend a fortune. The Koch brothers literally spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on this kind of stuff. And there's no counter interest. In other words, there's no like bicycle coalition that can put together that kind of money. So yeah. Okay, so more questions, do put them in there, but now let's get to the material for today. So what are the consequences? Important to note that for decades we kept saying will be, but absolutely look in the last 10 years, the consequences are all over. This documentary we're looking at this week, I just want to be clear, it's only one primary consequence, which is wildfires. And even that is in California, where they're being caused by, exacerbated by the climate crisis. Although they do happen in other parts of the world. I've already mentioned Australia, which by far had the largest wildfire ever recorded on the planet by many times over for the same reason. Because if you think about it, they're also on the Pacific Rim, and they are experiencing, in some ways, the same mega drought that we are. The thing about this, to be very clear about this particular documentary, and also just kind of an aside, I picked the best documentaries I can. They do have shortcomings, and I'm aware of that. But unfortunately, I don't make documentaries. I wish I did, in which case we'd have ones that are more pinpoint. But this one is good. But just to note, this doesn't, focus on the science behind it, because I don't think that's the primary issue right now. Scientists might disagree, but to give credit to scientists, in the last 40 or 50 years, they've done incredible work in proving overwhelmingly that the climate crisis is real and it has these various impacts. I don't think anyone in the room here needs to be convinced of that, or very few. If for different people in a different part of the country, it might be the primary issue. But for you, I don't think so. But this documentary puts a human face on that. And Also, to be clear, some of these documentaries like this one doesn't talk a whole lot about climate change, which is interesting, and we'll talk about that. Because, so why did I put it in the class if it doesn't? Well, because climate change is ultimately what is behind this. This wouldn't have happened without climate change. So in any event, let's see if this will click up. Here we are. So iClicker poll today, click start, select, and there we are. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to that. And we're counting down. So I know a number of people are not from California, so just hit E, but I think the majority of people probably are from California. Was there one actually in your town, wildfire? Was there one relatively close or relatively far away, but still where you felt the effects of the smoke? And in California, we've had wildfires like the Napa Valley fire that had impact 150 or 200 miles away in terms of smoke. Or are you someone from California who never experienced a wildfire? Full stop. Yeah, so majority of people have definitely experienced the impact. If you add the first two up, either in your home town or near your town, that's the majority, I think. Yeah, clearly. Great minority would be people who have never experienced any consequence of a wildfire in California, which is possible. So yeah, and I would be A, because the Thomas Fire did get to Santa Barbara. So yeah, let me just stop that. Okay, did I actually click to the right one? Yep. Yeah, we've talked about this before. When the public imagination really in the closing quarter of the 20th century, and that happened, by the way, relatively early. So a guy named Bill McKibben, you may have heard of, he may be the best known environmentalist in the US, wrote a book in the late 1980s called The Death of Earth. But anyhow, it was a best-selling book on the climate crisis and what was coming. But the big concern was sea level rise. And again, half the world's population lives near the seacoast, so it was thought to be the biggest concern. And for people who weren't directly on the coast, honestly, it just didn't seem like an issue. And that was the problem there, because if you heard there was going to be sea level rise, that might be really important to you if you live in a place like Santa Barbara. If you live in the middle of the continent in Omaha, Nebraska, it's probably not going to be very important to you. As a consequence, it seemed far off to many Americans. Not just far off to be far away. So if you're in Nebraska, it's a far away problem, but also long-term far away in time, because we were talking and people were talking about the amount of sea level rise that could be measured in single-digit millimeters per year. And people were like, geez, that's not much of a problem. It was a concern to countries that were actually all very low. So the Maldives are an example in the Pacific. Their average elevation is 1.5 meters, which is like that high. So that country is now going underwater and they're evacuating it. It also seemed like wealthy countries like the US could respond. So with that tiny little bit of sea level rise a year, we would just build dikes and seawalls and all sorts of things like that. So it wasn't an issue for a lot of people, unfortunately. It should have been. If you actually paid attention, if you read Bill McKibben's book, which is called The End of Nature, by the way, it was a problem, but most people just didn't think of it that way. We now know that there are many, many, many more consequences. And some of those are physical consequences like wildfires and flooding. And some of those are cultural things like water scarcity across the planet. Climate migration will be a huge issue. There are already tens of millions of people on the move now. It's impacting life all across the planet. But because this course is taking place in California, we're going to focus on a California issue. But I just want to make clear, just like I did earlier, that yeah, the climate crisis is the biggest environmental problem. I think that's fair to say, but there are a ton of other environmental problems. For California, wildfires are one of the biggest problems, but there are a ton of other problems across the planet. And this all happened, by the way, in the last 4 decades. So, most of the large wildfires that have happened in California happened in the last decade. And of course, the Thomas Fire is the closest one here. And as I mentioned, that's already been surpassed. If you approach this from sort of a scientific, statistical perspective, it's very clear. I mean, just look at the numbers on any of those metrics, where we are with like the number of wildfires, how much is that increasing? If you look at the number of tornadoes, look at the number of hurricanes, for example, on the East Coast, not only are they increasing in numbers, but they're increasing in strength. So if for example, the hurricane scale, it's usually on 1 to 5, what it is. And I think 5, I forget the exact number, it goes up. But recent hurricanes, like the one that hit the Bahamas, is kind of off the scale. So now scientists are talking about changing that scale. So you would not end with a Category 5 hurricane, but these would technically be Category 6 hurricanes. So statistically, you can see all that. But, what does it mean in human terms? I mean, you hear these numbers, okay, now we have Category 6 in addition to 5. What does that mean? So we're approaching this from a cultural perspective, which is why we have this particular documentary, and when we get to people's comments, you can see it really is hard hitting. Yeah. And just to be clear, one thing that people have thought for a while, that this would not impact wealthy countries and wealthy individuals. When the Thomas Fire hit here, and I keep talking about it because this was Santa Barbara's wildfire, and again, what I noted before, largest wildfire in California's history up until that point. At one point, it was spreading at the rate of 1 acre per second. It was impossible to get away from this. But the after effect, and we're going to talk about that because people made comments on this, was dramatic. And one of the most dramatic was Montecito, which is that very wealthy community north of us. You may know, like Oprah has a house there, and a lot of stars do. What happened was the Thomas Fire burned quite a bit around that community. And the firefighters did an amazing job of saving the people's homes. But what happened was, a month later, there was an incredible rain event. And what happened was there was literally a ½ inch of rain in 5 minutes. And it happened, unfortunately, at 3 a.m. in Montecito when people were asleep. What happened, because there was no longer that foliage there, and to hold back the water, there was a massive mudslide. The mudslide was 15 feet in height. It moved entire boulders with it. It was moving at the rate of 20 miles an hour in the middle of the night. And over 20 people were killed in Montecito. That was a result of the Thomas Fire, but not the fire itself, not smoke, not anything. This was another consequence that people don't necessarily think about. It was so big, by the way, if you've driven like down out of Santa Barbara, go down the 101, when that massive mudslide came, it crossed the 101, and in places the 101 had a mud barrier of 12 feet. I mean, this is 8 feet. So that was huge. And in fact, it closed the 101 for 2 weeks because of it. So, and again, there are bigger fires that came after that. But it's just something to think about. You hear about computer models, you hear about temperature rise 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius, but you just don't think about these other consequences. And it also makes clear, and there are people doing this now, by the way. Wealthy people are, and you can go online, you can find articles on it. They're trying to figure where's the safest place on Earth, because they know the climate crisis is here, but where can they go to be the safest? So the Maldives, that island nation's going away. Other places are going to experience incredible, suffering because of it. But people are literally trying to figure out, how they can avoid it using their wealth. Yeah. It does put a human face, this documentary on the climate crisis. Some people would argue, and that comment that the person made a little bit ago about their parents saying, well, it's just natural cycles and things like that. And you can argue with scientists if you want. I mean, I think it's not a very productive thing. I mean, for example, the IPCC, when it won the Nobel Prize, there were literally 1,500 scientists who shared in that, and there are many thousands more who work on it. But if you want to do that, fine. But how can you argue with facts now? How can you argue with the death of those 20 plus people in Montecito, or the nearly 100 people who died at the campfire in Paradise? It's just, you can't argue with it because it's here now. People will say, well, mudslides have always happened. That mudslide happened because the area above it was burned, full stop. And that was the biggest wildfire because it happened in December, because we didn't get our normal seasonal rains in October and November. Yeah. And again, I've noted, if we're talking about wildfires, let's talk about it because it's one of the big problems in California, but in other parts of the world, huge. So the Santa Barbara fire here, 280,000 acres. At the same time, the following year in Australia, 46 million acres. So almost 200 times larger than the largest fire in California history. If you look at the 20 largest wildfires in California's history, and this is a way of countering the people who say, well, there have always been wildfires. So that person's parents said there have always been wildfires. There always have. But if you look at the 20 largest wildfires in California's history, 15 of them took place in the 21st century, in the last 2 decades or so. And if you look at the Australia fire is 15 times larger than all those 15 combined. There's never been anything like this, both in severity or scope on the planet. Just extraordinary. So the argument that there have always been wildfires, yeah, there have always been wildfires, but not this many, not this bad. Anywhere near this many are bad. So we're going to jump to the class discussion part. So this is my thing I always say. First, I want to hear your comments. I've been mining the Canvas forum, but I want to see what you have to say. And speaking of that, let's look at the Canvas from today. Do more people ask questions? Yeah. As we discussed palm oil, I was eating my protein bar this morning, manufactured by the brand NoCal. Someone mentioned NoCal. I didn't mention that brand, but here it is. It's vegan, plant-based protein bar, and I noticed that palm oil was on the ingredients list. However, it had an asterisk on it, palm oil. When I read the asterisk, it said that the palm oil incorporated in the bar was sustainably sourced. Yeah, so this is a problem. And the person asked, is there a way to find out if it really is sustainably sourced? There are no international conventions or laws regarding this. So, for example, if you buy something in the United States that says organic, you know that the government is involved in making sure that's organic, and that tells you some things. So, for example, if you don't want to eat GMOs, you don't have to look for GMOs on the label. Just buy organic in the US because organic cannot be genetically modified. The problem is, with these other things, who's to say? So I don't know this company, and I don't know if it really is sustainably sourced. I don't really know what that would look like, but since there's no standard, it's a debatable issue. So for example, first you burn down the forest in Indonesia, the rainforest, and then you put in a grove of palm plants. Could you do that? Sure. Could you then practice sustainable farming practices there? What I mean is not, harvest too much, replant every time plants were taken out. Could you do that? Could you call that sustainable? I don't know. Maybe you could. But I do know that there's no way of ensuring that that really is outside of the US, unless there is a trading partner that is also organic. So, personally, I happen to like green tea. If you buy green tea from Japan and it's organic, it means the same thing because the US and Japan have a mutual relationship with organic. It's the same. But with other things, and just to be clear, and we'll talk about it again and again, but just to give a first pass at it, there is something called greenwashing. You will have brands especially saying that they are doing things that are green, sustainable, and wonderful. Generally, that means nothing. So we're going to watch a documentary called The True Cost, but the alternate one is also one of those Patriot Act episodes. And the host goes into a store and some garment, I forget what it was, and looks at the label, and the label said in very pronounced ways, 100% recycled. And it looks great. And it's designed to make you think that this is a 100% recycled garment. And then the shock, and what's so amazing in the episode is that was just the tag that was printed on. That tag was recycled, not the garment itself. If you looked and figured it out, you would realize it. But most people were encouraged to think that they were buying a recycled garment, and instead. And so, and again, I don't know this brand. Maybe they have some kind of sustainable palm oil, but I do know that a far simpler way is to not mess with, palm oil at all and get an organic oil from the U.S., like grapeseed oil or any, avocado oil, anything else. Okay. Fire in Paradise is one of the most scary and heartbreaking things I've ever seen. I honestly wanted to stop watching the film during many scenes because I felt overwhelmed, as if I was experiencing the fire along with everyone else as well. Yeah, many people, most people maybe, if you've read the comments, I hope you are, had the same impact. Many people noted that it was just really difficult, which is why I put a trigger warning on there, because it can be emotionally overwhelming. And especially given that poll we took with the iClicker, most people in the room have either directly or indirectly encountered a wildfire. And most of it, I think the images are striking, but I thought what made it so effective, and people commenting on this, was hearing firsthand from people who experienced the campfire. And I think that's an important issue, because when you hear about the Maldives in the Pacific, or I keep talking about Bangladesh and all, it just seems far away. But this is not far away. These are people just like you. And if you watch the alternate film, you already saw the first film on the Paradise Fire in English 22. The alternate is just about high school students and what they experienced and the consequences of the fire, and it can be incredibly moving because of it. So, and I think it's terrific that it is. I think the documentary did just what it was meant to do. And the unfortunate thing, and I'll just say this out of frustration, there are so many wonderful documentaries and all sorts of material. If you go online, even TikTok, YouTube, you'll find all sorts of things. Unfortunately, we just don't watch that stuff. Most of you don't. I do. It's my business. But on the other hand, it's kind of sad. I mean, when you think about influencers who get tens of millions, hundreds of millions of subscribers, and we watch whatever dribble they're putting out, when there's stuff like this out there. But this is, and I don't mean to be blaming anyone, because this is climate anxiety, and with climate anxiety, we may not want to face this. It's just too difficult to face it, so we tune out on something else. But what I always think is wonderful about a class format like this is that I can make you watch it. Sorry, but it is something that people should see, and it does raise a question. It's a really good one. How do you communicate this to people? I have a way, because you have to be here. I make you be here because of the iClicker. But how else do you do that? So when watching the film Fire in Paradise, I started having heavy flashbacks to where I was and what I was doing when the Paradise Fire happened. Where I'm from, my hometown is only 2 hours away from Paradise, but we were still heavily affected by that fire. I can remember feeling the same panic that people in the film were feeling. I can remember all of us in our town so nervous when thoughts began to pop up, such as, are the ashes going to land here? And another fire going to happen here? If Sacramento is being alerted about the potential harm of the ashes and smoke, do we have to worry too? I can remember all the students, the teachers, and parents protesting from our school district to cancel school because the air was so bad. Yeah, it's such a large class. We have people who actually were near the fire or knew someone by the fire, and this is an interesting comment, because it's not just that you saw the people experiencing it being frustrated, but people in this room were experiencing emotions because of this. And it's important to realize it can have, far-reaching implications, and that can be, if you know that was the North Complex fire, I think it was, which is like 150 miles from San Francisco, and this was like, I'm getting my dates mixed up, like 3 years ago, I forget. But you may remember, if you're from the Bay Area, that there was a time where in the middle of the day, it looked like twilight. It was dark and everything was red everywhere. That's because smoke had been blown over and the fire was so big, even though the Bay Area spreads out geographically, it still looked like twilight there. And it was a really eerie sight. And I had friends who were there. And it was also a problem because, it may look striking, but that's in the air. You can smell it in the air. When the Thomas Fire was here, you could clearly smell it. So when that fire happened, it impacted 7.8 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area alone, and many millions more outside of the Bay Area. And that was a fire that was, like I said, 150 miles away. There's a problem, and it's not just you would think like the ash is being released, but what happens during a wildfire, in addition to that particulate matter, it also produces nitrogen oxide and certain hydrocarbons which get elevated. And what that means is it worsens symptoms like bronchitis, emphysema, asthma, and all. So it's bad for everyone, but if you happen to have one of these issues, it really is a problem. And in fact, statistically, when this was happening in the Bay Area, they noted that exposure to heavy smoke raised the risk of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest by 70%. And again, this is not the stuff you think about. You think about the actual fire and what's happening and the people's lives are being disrupted, everything we saw in the documentary. But hey, 100, 200 miles away, people are dying of cardiac arrest. People who have asthma and bronchitis are, experiencing problems. Yeah. So let me just remind you what I said last time. I know this is the tough part of the class. It's not going to be so good next week when you meet a bunch of climate change deniers, but just hold on. It gets better because we will be talking about solutions, and that's not today. Sorry. Like many people, this person had avoided watching Fire in Paradise so long because they knew that it would be completely heartbreaking. I live about an hour away from Paradise. Remember how terrified everyone was there, even though we were so far from the flames. I can't even imagine the emotions that residents of Paradise and the surrounding communities must have experienced. My high school was shut down for a week and a half, not only because of the downpour of ashes made the air quality unhealthy, but because their campus an hour away was an evacuation site. So that happened with a lot of facilities like that, with schools and hospitals. They became evacuation sites, and they do all the time. So that happens. It happened with the Thomas Fire here. It happens with all of them. And it's just striking. I remember when the Thomas Fire happened, I woke up one morning and I walked outside, and it was like the eeriest sight in the world because the ground was gray, white, and there was fluttering down the stuff that kind of looked like snow coming down, but it was ashes, and the whole city was covered in ashes. Buildings were covered in ashes on top. As you may know, I may have mentioned, for many years I made my living as a furniture maker, and one thing that I always was aware of, that when you can smell something, that's a problem. So in other words, a lot of amateur woodworkers say they love to work wood because they love to smell the smell of it and all. And if you smell it, that means particulates are entering your lungs. And the smaller the particulates, things that you can't see, are the worst. And you can wear, dust protection, have HEPA filters and things like that. But if you can smell it, that means things are getting into your lungs, which is why I confess my partner and my little girl, we left Santa Barbara during that fire. Another comment from a student: during my first year at UCSB, I became friends with someone who lived in Paradise. This was a comment from a couple of years ago. I remember him telling me how beautiful Paradise was and how I had to go there and visit, but soon his hometown was engulfed in flames, and he and his family lost everything. He had to move back with his family to regroup, restart their lives. I was heartbroken when I heard about the fire, but after watching the documentary Fire in Paradise, my heart was completely crushed. Yeah, a lot of people had connections, either once removed or, 3 times removed or so. sometimes we forget, I think, with something like this, how it impacts people far away from the fire. So this person's friend, yeah, they're down in Santa Barbara, they're hundreds of miles away. They can't smell the smoke, they can't see any consequence of it. Nothing is like that. But it is impacting them and impacts people all over the world. And in terms of Paradise, there's some homes there that are going to never be rebuilt. Some businesses will never reopen. Homes will not be rebuilt because people didn't have adequate insurance. And in some cases with wildfires now, small insurance companies can't deal because it's just, with billions of dollars worth of claims being made, they may not be able to continue. And that's even the other factors like smoke. So another thing to think about, which we often don't, is runoff from this. So when houses and everything are burned and destroyed, there's runoff into the groundwater. Chemicals like benzene go into the groundwater. So benzene is a particularly bad one. So written here, the EPA classifies water with benzene levels of about 500 parts per billion as hazardous. So some samples in the Paradise Fire were found to have 2,000 parts per billion in the water. So the groundwater itself becomes, in that case, 4 times higher than is acceptable. In the Sonoma County fires, there were benzene levels there of 40 parts per billion. That's 80 times what the EPA calls acceptable. So whoever thinks about that, right? You think about a fire and all, but you don't realize that suddenly, the very groundwater there, the very place is made significantly less habitable. Yeah, the speed of it. Moving at 80 football fields a minute, and then eventually covering the size of Chicago. So if you didn't see the documentary, that's how big it was. This incident should have not been as big a deal as it was, became seared in the memories of the 50,000 people who managed to escape, but also ended up being the last memory for 80 people. No matter how crazy the statistics of the fire are, nothing was more impactful than seeing the vigor of the fire contrasted with how serene Paradise was. Yeah, the name. Paradise. It's supposed to be paradise. Not only will the altering climate worldwide affect the Earth's ecosystems from a scientific point of view, but it has a sentiment attached to it as it kills all kinds of species, including humans, but not just humans in general, or grandparents, parents, brothers, sisters, neighbors. Yeah, it's happening and needs to be addressed. Again, statistics like the fact that it's moving 80 football fields a minute, it's the size of Chicago, that may be instrumental, but as this person notes, nothing was more impactful than seeing the vigor of the fire contrasted with how serene Paradise once was. The fire just doesn't impact a number of acres, however many that is, but a real place which was once inhabited by real people. And this person rightly notes, we're talking about human beings, human life, human cost, human, but there are lots of beings there, not all human beings. And I would imagine you could have a whole nother documentary just on how the Paradise, so the alternate documentary I mentioned is how high school students were impacted by the fire, which is great. You could have a whole nother documentary on how other species were impacted by it. Birds, animals, fish. Yeah, so again, this is kind of what we're dealing with in this class, not from the scientific statistical point of view, but from the human cost. And it is something we really need to think about, how it impacts other species as well. I think the next comment is sort of related to this. Let me see. This film was difficult to watch, largely because of how human it is. In my other ecology classes, I've always been told the cold, hard facts and numbers. While the statistics are convincing and concerning, they never made me feel as distraught and as the personal account, on-site footage, and recorded phone calls. Those phone calls were very striking, presented in this film. Again, I have enormous respect for people who work with numbers and statistics and all here. Offering, the cold, hard facts. But, even if you're not a scientist, you don't have to be a scientist. There are things that impact you and things you can do, by the way. And I would say one of them, and let's just sort of stand back from the film a moment and think about the film. Communication is like a terrific example of something you can do. And why I say that, look how effective this film is. I mean, the real issue here with this film is getting more people to watch it and be aware of it. But I mean, it's incredibly effective at communicating, and something like film, for all the reasons this person notes, can be very convincing. And let me just give a plug here. You know, UCSB has a wonderful film and media department, and we have specialists in the climate crisis, people like Janet Walker, who used to be chair of the department. And if you're interested in that, in thinking about how you would communicate something like this, it's great. And I would also note, okay, even if you're not interested in becoming a film and media major, that's fine. But, you know, media has been democratized, right? You all know this in the last couple of decades. So anyone with a smartphone, which now can record pretty damn good 4K video, can upload things to TikTok, YouTube, and all. You know, I could imagine someone just going to, you know, Paradise, and all you would really need is a phone and just getting personal accounts, and it would probably be pretty much effective as this was, or in a certain way, if people wanted to do it. Yeah, I do think this, to be clear, I think it's complementary to the natural sciences and all. So the statistics are necessary, and to know what the underlying problem is, to know things like, which I would have never known, that the benzene levels in the groundwater are at an unacceptably unsafe level, 4 times that level. Who would ever know that unless you had people diligently work trying to figure that out? Anyhow, next comment. iClicker poll. Yeah, how difficult was this to watch? Many people said it was difficult to watch. How difficult indeed was it to watch? Extraordinarily difficult, pretty difficult, difficult at times. You can tell I just sort of make this stuff as I'm writing it. So I just, like, in a scale of like 1 to 10 or so, or haven't you watched it? And I'm just curious. Some people extraordinary. The second group, pretty difficult, would be the biggest, and especially if you combine the top 2, extraordinary difficult, pretty difficult, most difficult at times. Only a small minority of people thought it wasn't difficult to watch. So I think that's interesting. So 28 people. Seems like when I turned around, that number was higher before. But really, so if you're talking 5% of the class, would be 40 people. So what's that, like 4% of the class didn't find it difficult to watch. And whoops, pull this back. And sorry for that, for the fact that it was difficult. But I think the fact that it was difficult really underscores how effective it is. So next comment, as an ES major and a climate activist, I've watched many films about the climate crisis. And by the way, there are many out there if you're interested, some great ones. Some we'll watch in here, some we watch later in English 24. Climate crisis and the impacts it has caused and will continue to cause if action is not taken immediately. However, I do not recall any film that has evoked the same level of emotion that Fire in Paradise did. I found myself reaching for a box of tissues more than once. And I think this person is not being metaphorical. And in fact, that it brought them to tears. And the next comment is sort of in a similar vein. So let me jump to that. It's easy to see why this would be such an important film to broadcast. In fact, I sometimes think that films like these are more important to watch than films that spew a bunch of facts. This documentary had me so engrossed and invested that I even shed a few tears at some point. I feel like I just went through such a visceral, cathartic experience after watching the utter devastation that this wildfire created. Looking at environmental issues from a humanistic perspective rather than a scientific one allows people to form emotions about the climate crisis rather than simply being exposed to facts. I think that's quite right. I mean, your opinion may change from facts, but emotions have a way of really investing. And I think it really has to do with the notion of empathy, that we can be empathetic with other beings, and I mean human and other beings, animals as well, because you can feel empathy. And so I noted here, to read it to you, according to the Encyclopedia of Social Psychology, quote, empathy is often described as understanding another person's experience by imagining oneself in that other situation. One's understanding of the person experience, one understands the other person's experience as if it were being experienced by the self, but without the self actually experiencing it. And I think it's remarkable because I think empathy is this basic human emotion that's so important and we kind of lack and is kind of tuned out in many ways by our culture. And I would offer up as an example, people walk up and down State Street and see unhoused people all the time, and we sort of ignore them and just have no empathy for them. But I think what was so effective is about this film, and what's so effective about some types of communication like this one is that can activate a feeling of empathy, even though you don't experience it directly. You haven't, in other words, you haven't actually met that person being interviewed. And as this comment notes, the person says, I went through such a visceral, cathartic experience by watching the utter devastation. And it's interesting because I think, again, to make a pitch for communication, that's how it can be so incredibly effective. And that's why I think what's so exciting is that this is alive and well on the internet, right? So you can communicate something in half a minute on TikTok, and an emotion like this can be communicated. And again, the problem is there's so much out there that communicates the wrong kinds of emotions and all, but it, yeah. And again, I respect the natural sciences, but empathy is not their stock in trade. So this course really wants to convince people in part by make you aware of it in a way that's not just intellectual but emotional. The problem is, well, okay, let me jump to the next slide and then I can get to the problem. 2019, Greta Thunberg delivered a powerful speech asking people to act as if their house is on fire. But this is no longer an if, our house is literally on fire. The climate crisis is a daunting task, and at times makes us feel like sitting ducks, as people did in the film, waiting for the climate change or fire to wipe us out. However, I have hope for the future. I believe that my generation will be able to make the cultural change to finally put out the fire that's engulfed our home that we call the planet Earth. That was a very controversial statement that Greta Thunberg made. It may not sound it. So the statement is, our house is on fire. You may have heard this. If there's nothing else that you know about Greta Thunberg, you should know that statement. Why that was controversial? Because people who talk about the climate crisis as real are often, so you will hear me and people, environmentalists, will often talk about climate change deniers. Who are those? Those are people that deny that climate change is real. That's kind of the term we have for them. It's like having these term like, pro-life, pro-choice. They are climate change deniers. They in turn call people like me a climate alarmist. Why? Because according to them, the problem's not that bad, and people like me are just alarming the public for no good reason. And as a consequence, and it's fascinating, people were anxious about actually coming across as an alarmist. In other words, they call us alarmists, but let's not prove them right by being alarmists. But Greta Thunberg, and it's remarkable because, people have been talking about this for decades, and you have politicians like Al Gore, you have environmentalists like Bill McKibben's been in the space for decades, and they all were kind of like, oh yeah, maybe we shouldn't. And Greta Thunberg just came out and said it, our house is on fire. And it was such a striking statement because it is an alarmist statement, but hey, you should be alarmed. And if you don't believe it, if you haven't watched the documentary, I bet you will at the end, because our house really is literally on fire. And because no one wanted to come across being like that person, right? I mean, that's the iconic thing, right? You yell, I yelled fire in this theater and people start running out. That's being an alarmist, and that's a problem. But it's a clever move on part of deniers too. But this was given at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Our house is on fire. Literally, lives are at stake. And here, literally, places are being burned. There is a problem with this, though. I will note it that people can get so overwhelmed by it, and this fire might do it, that you come sort of petrified by it. And in fact, this person notes, we're like a sitting duck. That's a problem. I mean, but we have to be honest and communicate the problem as well as it is. And this course tries to balance the material. Okay. Next one. So next comment. Having taken English 22 already, I watched the second film and found it to be effective because the people that tell the story, the fact that the film showcased the story of young kids around my age, and again, this is high school students at the time in Paradise, California, made me think about what the situation may have been like if it had happened to me and those around me. So again, this is where empathy is being engaged, seeing people who lived a very similar life to yours, and then their lives got turned completely upside down, was very disheartening, but also very close to home. When I watched the other films, such as the one starring Leonardo DiCaprio or Al Gore, although very powerful, I didn't get the same feeling. This film showed that this type of disaster can happen to anyone at any moment and change your life forever. And that's why I selected that alternate film, because it did center on people your age. So in a way, it's simpler. It's more, you can get engaged more quickly when it's someone you can actually connect with, rather than, Al Gore, who's in his 70s, or Leonardo DiCaprio is, intensely famous or something like that. And that was produced by New Yorker magazine. I think that the one that most people watched is the better film, but if you want to sort of engage with something in a way that would engage you more as your group, I think that's right. And there was plenty of empathy in the comments. Yeah. Let me jump here because I'm taking time and not getting to everything, but that's okay. So many people had personal connections here, and here's another one that we don't think about. My dad's a firefighter. It talks about how draining and dangerous wildfires can be, and how he lost friends trying to help out in situations like this. And even though he talks about his experiences, I don't ever think I fully understood how detrimental wildfires truly are. I've heard the stories and watched the news, but this documentary really opened my eyes up to how climate change is such a large, dangerous influence, and how it made fires so much worse. So yeah, the Thomas Fire I keep talking about, the Santa Barbara fire. The number of people I mentioned afterwards died in Montecito with the mudslides. Very few people were harmed in Santa Barbara because of the work of the firefighters, although at least one did die doing that. We don't think about that. We think about the people there. But for the Thomas Fire, I remember reading in the paper, there were 9,000 firefighters mobilized there. So, we just don't think about these other consequences. Again, consequences of the climate crisis, sea level rise and all. Yep. The same can be said for other things as well. And I just want to clarify that. We could be talking about hurricanes here just as well. But this one is our big issue. So I won't dwell on that more. Next comment. Documentaries like these should be played in science classes across the country because they could further influence the generations who would continue to take action against the worsening climate change. However, big corporations and businesses are the ones who hold wads of money, and most of them aren't doing anything to slow and their impact on the world and its climate. Big names, brands, companies need to be held accountable for their actions, whether it be for something giant like starting a devastating wildfire, or just admitting that they need to alter production and come up with new sustainable model that could potentially make a difference in the world we all live in. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Regarding the beginning of this, and we're going to talk about it, but I'll just do it as a first pass. The fossil fuel industry and its affiliates are very effective, and they've actually pinpointed education as an issue of theirs. So you might imagine, as an educator, I think it's very important. The fossil fuel industry does too. They want to introduce K through 12 people. So you're going to read text tomorrow for next week that was targeted at K through 12 teachers in order to get them to be teaching denial. They've also worked and focused on politicians. So I think it's, I want to say, I actually quoted in another speech, but I think it's North Dakota, where they're trying to put a law in that you cannot teach climate change in a classroom in any school. And there are other laws that are pending that work just like it works with creationism. So you may know in some states, if you didn't, it's pretty remarkable, that if you teach evolution in a high school, the state mandates that you give an equal amount of time to creationism. So if you say, the universe is born 13.5 billion years ago, and this is how everything proceeded since. You then have to say, but many people believe that the universe was born less than 10,000 years ago, exactly as it's described. There were no dinosaurs, Adam and Eve and all. But people want to have that or trying to get that in schools. And the reason is they do not want your generation to become mobilized. They want your generation to allow them to continue what they're doing. And at the end of the day, and as this person notes, you're looking at names, brands, companies, it's all about profit. That's all it is. And we're going to see comparisons to the tobacco industry, which knowingly sold an addictive poison that killed millions of people. And they continued doing it because it was profitable. So let's jump to the next slide. Let's take a poll. I can get over here. So how useful did you find the documentary? And again, many of you are going to hit E if you haven't watched it. Really useful and engaging, kind of useful, not very useful, not at all useful. Let's see what people thought. Yeah, we seem to be doing that for the first two. So I wasn't going to stop now, but since everyone is kind of getting anxious, we'll stop here and see you next Tuesday. I hope you enjoy the reading and material.